All right. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you are, whoever you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you live to talk about hallucinogens. Time to talk about dissociatives and hallucinogens. So I did I think, a pretty detailed video about addiction last year, explaining kind of the neuroscience and the psychology of addiction, how different motivational and connection and attachment systems are messed up when we consistently consume substances that are mind altering. So one of the big topics for the last 4 or 5 months has been hallucinogens. It's been a big deal in a lot of the scientific literature. It's been a big deal in the news. You've heard a lot about probably these kind of millionaire investor tech people up in Silicon Valley who've been microdosing with LSD, trying to kind of manage their stress and their depression better and be more creative and get more done, etc., by using just very small amounts of LSD. And it's a point of great contention nowadays among therapists, psychiatrists, treatment professionals, and addiction professionals, because we've been talking about hallucinogens for at least, 90 years. I mean, things like LSD and MDMA and ketamine have been around since the 1920s and 1930s. I think, I can't remember, I think it was Albert Hoffman who created LSD. No, I don't think it was Albert Hoffman. I'd have to double check that. But again, Merck created MDMA. Ketamine was also created in a lab. LSD was also created in a lab. So all these drugs have been around for a long, long time. And these drugs have served a purpose in terms of psychological enhancement and psychological mood management, but also kind of more medical applications in terms of how we anesthetize people or how we, deal with, clinical syndromes. So I wanted to talk today about hallucinogens because I think there are some misconceptions about these drugs. And, it's one of these interesting things where there's a lot of social and political BS related to these kinds of drugs. And I think if you listen to people like Sam Harris talk about his experiences with LSD and his beliefs about these kinds of drugs, and he's a neuroscientist, there's this question mark. There's this ever-looming question mark about drugs like LSD and peyote and mescaline and ketamine and all that. And this is not a new thing. I mean, we've had a question mark about these drugs since the late 50s and 60s when Timothy Leary and, who's now called Ram Dass, were at Harvard studying these drugs, and they were kicked out of Harvard studying these drugs because of their lack of scientific rigor during their research endeavors when they were looking at psilocybin, mushrooms. But now there's a huge debate about, how politicized their firing was and what the real deal is. And you can check out Harvard's website and see what they say about it. They try and paint a very nice picture because why wouldn't you as a university? Anyways, here's another point. The FDA is also kind of confused about these substances. And the FDA says, for instance, that all the 5 drug schedules, Schedule 1 are like the worst or least useful for medical purposes or for scientific purposes. It says Schedule 1 drugs, this is straight from the FDA's website. Schedule 1 drugs, substances, or chemicals are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. Some examples of Schedule 1 drugs are heroin, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, medical or marijuana, cannabis, ecstasy, methaqualone, and peyote. These are examples of Schedule 1 substances from the FDA's website. And what's fascinating is there are current medical uses for marijuana, LSD, ecstasy. that's been studied in the literature, and I'm going to talk about what the literature says. So according to what the FDA says is the definition for a Schedule 1 highly dangerous, highly abusable substance, LSD, marijuana, and ecstasy don't meet that. It's fascinating that the FDA has not caught up to what the research says. Now, this is not me saying that these drugs are good and that we should use them all the time, or that we should use them with any consistency. And I'll make that point later. However, it's just interesting that the FDA says one thing about how dangerous these drugs are, but the scientific literature says something else. Also, the last half of the definition of a Schedule 1 substance, according to the FDA, is that these drugs have a high potential for abuse. And what you find if you read the research literature is that drugs like LSD, peyote, ketamine, ecstasy, etc., do not have a high potential for abuse. If you read the statistics from SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the rate of people abusing these drugs is much lower compared to alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, heroin, benzos, and those kinds of drugs. So it's interesting that these kinds of drugs are Schedule 1 when they're not nearly as often abused, and they don't have the same abuse potential because, again, as I'll talk about later in the research, drugs like LSD don't really activate your dopamine, your striatum, your midbrain, your D2 receptors with the same intensity or frequency and consistency as something like alcohol, heroin, or meth would, which I think is just fascinating. So basically what I'm trying to say is the FDA is full of hypocrites, and they actually haven't read the scientific literature. So let's talk about the different kinds of hallucinogen drugs that pretty much everyone will either run across or hear about or see like a movie in Cheech and Chong or something, or hear someone talk about. So there's two basic groups of hallucinogen drugs. The first group is the serotonin, kind of the serotonin-based drugs. So these are drugs like LSD, mescaline, MDMA, and whatnot. And then there are more kind of glutamate-driven drugs. So I'm dividing these drugs based upon what neurotransmitters they predominantly activate. And I say predominantly because almost anything you ingest is going to affect multiple neurotransmitter groups. However, drugs like LSD, mescaline, mushrooms, MDMA, NVMe, all these drugs are predominantly 5-HT2A receptor drugs, serotonin drugs. Whereas drugs like PCP, ketamine, and MK801 are more glutamate receptor-based drugs. And they do lots of complicated things in the brain, but for now, let's just keep those two classes. Then there's this kind of, let's say, combined class of drugs. And these are things like ibogaine and ayahuasca. Ibogaine and ayahuasca kind of work both on serotonin and on glutamate. And then there's this last kind of subgroup of drugs kind of that work on the acetylcholine system, the cholinergics like scopolamine and atropine. These drugs are not very often used anymore, not dealt with very much anymore. So let's talk about the brief history of these drugs. So these drugs have been used for thousands and thousands of years in rituals. There's a couple of articles I read in kind of anthropology journals and archaeology journals that shows that as part of ceremonies, as part of, I don't know, as part of kind of rituals, people have been using drugs for a long, long time. In fact, I saw an article the other day that showed that kind of the Aborigines of Australia were likely to have been using kind of peyote or mescaline type drugs for 40,000 years or so. That's what we think, at least. Other research shows that, other studies show that drugs like mescaline have been around for about 5,000 years, according to archaeological digs. Mushrooms, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, have been found in kind of archaeological digs from about 3000 BC. Now, these more lab-created drugs like ketamine, PCP, LSD, etc., These have only been around in the last 100 years or so. So like I said, you know, ketamine was about the 1930s, 1920s. MDMA was about the 1930s. LSD is about the same. All these drugs are very, very new, comparatively speaking. What's fascinating is the ones that are older are the ones that we abuse the least, whereas the ones that are newer, the lab-created drugs, these are the ones that are so strongly psychoactive. These are the ones that we abuse the most, right? I read a cool article the other day that showed that there are logs from Christopher Columbus when he was first visiting here in like the 1600s that showed that he observed the native Haitians in Haiti consuming something like peyote or mescaline and doing ritual things, but not getting sloppy and not getting crazy. So there's this weird history of people using these hallucinogens in very limited ways to not get crazy, to not get stoned, to not lose their mind, but to really kind of really dig into an emotional or ritual experience, which is very different, but similar to how a lot of people in the club scene might use ketamine or ecstasy or other drugs to have an extremely euphoric experience as they dance at a rave or something of that nature. So it's similar in how it works. However, the rate at which we abuse it nowadays is pretty high, comparatively speaking, to LSD, mushrooms, and what have you. In fact, I've worked in the drug rehab world for about 10 years now, and the number of people that I find walking through the door who have a serious problem with LSD or ketamine or PCP or something like that is very, very small. Very, very small. And the majority of people who want to use drugs and alcohol to escape and manage feelings and deal with psychological pain, as I propose, usually graduate from dissociatives to heroin, meth, alcohol, pot, and use those things consistently because those things actually really dampen your experience of psychological pain, your experience of loneliness and disconnection, because they actually really hard hit your opiate system and your dopamine system, whereas hallucinogens tend to really hard hit your serotonin system. So that's a brief history of these drugs, and there's so much more detail out there. Please fact check me. These are very, very important things to get right. So what does the research say about these drugs? Now let's go back to, again, the FDA. The FDA said that things like LSD and ketamine and all these things are Schedule I drugs. Or they didn't say ketamine, they said LSD, peyote, and ecstasy are Schedule I drugs. So here's what we know from the research about the abuse potential and the medical utility of these drugs, okay? So first, let's talk about broadly what these drugs do in the brain and what they produce in terms of emotions and behaviors. So there's a lot of research using rats. There's a lot of research using zebrafish and other mammals, apes, chimpanzees, etc. And that shows that, basically speaking, across the serotonin-based drugs, specifically things like LSD and whatnot, they have anti-anxiety effects. Drugs like ketamine also have kind of anti-anxiety effects. And one of the ways that we know this is by watching rats or zebrafish in these tightly controlled experimental conditions where they're put in a stressful circumstance and we observe their behavior. And if they're on these drugs, they're actually less afraid and are more willing to engage in these elevated plus maze stressful circumstances. And we also see less freezing behavior because, again, part of the fear panic response is fight, flight, freeze. So we see less freezing behavior when animals are on drugs like LSD, with LSD having the strongest anti-freezing behavior results, whereas MDMA slightly less so, ketamine less so, mescaline, atropine, scopolamine, mescaline, and all these things kind of less so than LSD, but still less freezing. Not surprisingly, studies with drugs like PCP, which are heavily glutamate drugs and dopamine drugs, show very erratic and quasi-aggressive behavior in animals. So if you're looking for an anti-anxiety drug, PCP really kind of removes fear, but it doesn't actually make you less anxious. It kind of makes you more aggressive and impulsive. And again, if you look at any human being who's ever had PCP, they're kind of euphoric and aggressive. So it's not really an anti-anxiety exploratory trip drug. So I think PCP should be left out of this talk from now on. So socially, what do these drugs do socially? So how do they affect our social behaviors? So in animals, what we see, especially rodents and zebrafish, what we see is LSD, MDMA, ibogaine, and ketamine makes animals generally more social, whereas drugs like mescaline and scopolamine and atropine, we don't really know what they do because we haven't been able to do a lot of replication studies yet to figure out how kind of effective they are at decreasing social anxiety and making us more sociable. And again, a lot of this research that I'm pulling from is very new because, again, the war on drugs and all this crap has kept scientists from being able to study this from about the 80s through the early 2000s. So it's only since about the early mid-2000s that we've been able to really study these drugs to get an idea of what they actually do. In animal models, what we find is that all of these drugs will actually activate the dopamine pathway, the dopamine addictive or reward pathway, which means that all of these drugs possess some form of addictive potential. So they all activate the D2 striatum areas of the brain. But LSD and MDMA apparently have very, very low addictive potential in animal models, especially compared to the glutamate drugs like ketamine and things of that nature. So again, back to the FDA. Research is consistently showing, at least in animal models, that LSD and things like that have very low addictive potential. So that's half of the Schedule 1 requirement. Schedule 2 is, do they have some kind of medical, or Schedule 1, the other half of the Schedule 1 requirement is, do they have some kind of medical use? And I'll come to that later when we talk about the good, the bad, and the weird. So before we get onto that, though, there's a new category of lab-created serotonin drugs called NBOME, which kind of operate like LSD with kind of reportedly worse negative side effects. And prior to this drug, NBOME, there was bromofly, which sounds very weird, but that's the name of it because it works on bromo in the brain. And there's others. Or it's based on a chemical called bromo, I'm sorry. And there's many, many others of lab-created serotonin-based drugs that are supposed to mimic the effects of LSD for about the last 10 or 12 years. And the problem with these drugs is that they have worse negative side effects. They are more potent, which means they also are more addicting in the dopamine sense. And the other problem is that it's not about the getting high. These drugs are being created for research purposes to help with depression, anxiety, PTSD. However, what's happening is the formulas are being stolen and sold in the black market so that they can be sold to get more and more people hooked, as it were. Because again, the addiction world is a big business, right? There's one article, I can't remember what magazine it was in, but there was an article that came out a couple years ago, it was in The Economist. There was an article in The Economist in like 2015 that looked at the dark web, and it showed that in about a year and a half, people made like 20 or like $50 million or something like that in illegal drug sales on just the dark web. This is not even like you're a drug dealer across the street who's selling pot. This is like just the dark web. So imagine how much money people make off of drugs of abuse. So it's a big business. It's a huge fucking business. And we need to keep that in mind when it comes to these drugs and decisions we make about the law and decisions we make about legalizing or decriminalizing or moving up and down in schedules. Because there's a money game here. And the money game is equally important to the health and wellness game related to drugs of abuse. So we need to be thinking on two different levels at the same time. How will our decisions about drugs and alcohol affect, the illegal economy, the black market for drugs, so to speak, and how will our decisions affect health and wellness of the society? So on that point, let's talk about the health and wellness of society, since I don't have much to say about the economy part of it because I don't study that. So what does the research say that is good or useful or promising about drugs like LSD and hallucinogens? So what the research says is we can use drugs like LSD to help trigger parts of the brain so we can study motor behaviors or affect dysregulation. So LSD has been used in lab experiments for the last 10 years or so to try and mimic other behavioral disorders, to try and figure out how to treat them better and what drugs to use to treat them better, which is great. So having LSD available in the lab is useful in that way, right? And that's just one facet. Research consistently shows that drugs like mushrooms and LSD decrease the functional connectivity in parts of the emotional and intellectual braking system. So like the insula, the thalamus, the anterior cingulate, posterior cingulate. And it decreases functional interactivity across the brain. So what that means, very briefly, is one of the reasons why people feel more creative and more emotional when they're on drugs like LSD and psilocybin is because our default mode network, our let's chill out and stop things from happening network, is out of commission. It can't do its job. So we have to think more flexibly. Different parts of the brain have to interact more fluidly, as it were, as opposed to in a more regimented, systematic way, which has pros and cons. It can help you be creative. It can also drive you psychotic, right? One of the reasons why people want to study LSD is to really try and help with the emotional side of it, though, to help with the emotional side of mental health disorders like anxiety, PTSD, and depression. And that's because the research I cited here shows basically these substances like LSD in particular, and mushrooms less so, help decrease processing in the amygdala and could be potentially very helpful because it basically shuts out the top-down prefrontal cortex down to the amygdala system. So it allows us to kind of work through our experiences more fluidly by not having as many constraints on the amygdala. Another great finding from the literature is that kind of low doses of LSD actually promote substantive changes in the trait of openness to experience, which is correlated with intelligence and creativity. And again, basically speaking, mild to moderate decrease in anxiety, mild decrease in depression, and mild to moderate decrease in reliving and hypervigilance symptoms of PTSD across the board, with very controlled studies for things like LSD and things like ketamine specifically. Ketamine actually seems to do more for depression as well. So theoretically, a small but growing cadre of authors, they're proposing that we integrate very low doses of hallucinogens like LSD and ketamine and stuff like that into drug treatment programs. And the problem with this is we're using a potentially addictive substance to treat addiction. So this is not tested, but it's definitely worth thinking about, because if we can find another substance like naltrexone or Suboxone that has even less addictive potential, because that's the goal, then we'll probably have better outcomes in terms of abstinence and decreasing cravings. But again, we don't have a lot of literature on that, and we haven't had access to that. There's a small body of literature that shows that magic mushrooms or psilocybin is very useful for relieving cluster headaches and migraines, but only in very small doses. And the problem is no real randomized controlled clinical trials have been done Very, very few have been done. And the problem for drugs like ketamine, which is showing promise for depression and anxiety, is that we don't have many long-term studies. So there have been a number of randomized controlled clinical trials for ketamine, but there have not been many long-term studies to see what dose over what period of time and for how long past 6 months, etc. Someone needs to either use the drug, not use the drug, etc. And the other thing is these drugs do very, very well to relieve the affective, the emotional side of it, but they don't work very well for the motivational, kind of the dopamine system and behavioral components of depression or anxiety. So they work a little bit like typical antidepressants in that we get more serotonin going on, but they don't quite work so well because we don't get much motivation going on. And that's where we have to think, how useful are these drugs? With regard to the bad, so I said good and bad. So here's the bad about these drugs, according to the literature, not my opinion. It seems like LSD mixed with alcohol in particular generally produces more negative effects and more hallucinations. So more feelings of irritability and weirdness and kind of weird dissociative experiences and hallucinations. The other problem, and research shows this consistently, is that using hallucinogens too often or too intensely activates brain networks in essentially the same way as we see schizophrenics' brains work. So basically, too consistent and too intense use of LSD can make you psychotic. You know, there's all sorts of stories from the kind of Jerry Garcia, Grateful Dead era that you've heard of people who've used way too much LSD and their brain is fried and they are often like so disconnected that they can't hold a straight conversation with you. Now I know that's just kind of a trope and not really a research-based fact, but what we see from the research is you can have more and more paranoid and more psychotic experiences if you abuse and overuse drugs like LSD and mushrooms, because your brain can only handle so much serotonin at once, right? One interesting study showed that regular use, this is a quote from them, regular use of psychedelic drugs could potentially lead to structural changes in brain areas supporting attentional processes, self-referential thoughts like self-reflection, and internal mentation. So can you actually think before you do something? So there's research that's showing it could be problematic if we do it too much. A series of studies shows that generally speaking, although the addictive potential is low, the acute toxicity, so how damaging it could be to the brain, is in the moderate range, and the chronic toxicity, which is kind of damage to the brain cells, is mild to moderate. So we can use too much, so we might not be addicted to it as easily, but we might be hurting our brain in some way, shape, or form that we're not aware of. Research shows, for instance, that drug users' perceptions of harm don't match the FDA rating scales. And isn't it funny that the research shows consistently that abuse is less so, especially if it's done in a controlled way, but the FDA rates them as high abuse potential. And there's no medical purpose. However, we're showing that there is legitimate medical purpose in the world of psychology and addiction rehab. Don't know. So there's a cultural perception of these drugs, there's a scientific perception of these drugs, there's a political perception of these drugs. All three perspectives need to start meeting. There's also a ceiling to how mystical or transcendent you can feel or become whenever you're intoxicated on drugs like LSD, according to the literature. So there's a misconception that it's a perfectly reasonable thing to trip consistently to keep like growing and expanding your mind. According to the research, there's a ceiling because of how much serotonin we can produce and how much serotonin we can tolerate and reuptake, etc. Like we reach a limit of oversaturation to where we're not really getting anything anymore and we're just becoming psychotic, essentially. Finally, as with anything we can ingest, snort, or inhale, or whatever, is just bad for your brain, right? You can drink too much, you can eat too much, you can do too many whippets or duster, you can do too much ketamine or GHB or whatever, or LSD, and your brain is not going to do well. Our brain is designed to operate in such a way that it can function. There's like a window of tolerance for the brain in terms of different neurotransmitters. And it's different for every person because everyone's genetics is different. The number of D2 receptors, the number of 5-HT2A receptors, etc., is different for every person. So what you can naturally tolerate is going to be different compared to your neighbor, your friend, your girlfriend, whatever. So we all have a window of tolerance, and we need to figure out how to, if you do consume these substances, work within your window of tolerance and use them only in a very controlled and regimented way. So at the end of the day, the research on drugs like LSD, mushrooms, ketamine, all these things is very mixed. And most of that is due to the fact that we just haven't had much time to actually experiment with these things. So we need more time. We need more research. We especially of the randomized controlled clinical trial variety to figure out if we can adequately stimulate our serotonin system in such a way that it relieves anxiety or depression or PTSD symptoms. If it does anything useful for mood and motivation, we don't quite know. We have a growing body of literature, but and as you'll see, if you go to my Patreon, www.patreon.com/Dr. Patrick Lockwood, and you read the research I cited here, most of it is, let's see, 2011, 2014, 17, 15, 2014, and Timothy Leary back in 1983, 1962, 16, 12. So basically, a lot of the research has been done in the last 10 years because it's been a no-no for a long, long time. So I'll leave you with this summary of all the research I read. There's over 70-something citations in this talk for today. Again, you can go see them all and fact check me if you go to my Patreon. It's real simple. These drugs have some potential for being helpful, it seems like. Now, this is not me advocating you using them. This is not me advocating that they are a cure or a solution for depression, anxiety, PTSD, or anything of that nature, because we're too complex as creatures. And there's always a social component to any mental illness. There's always a biological component. There's always a psychological component. So we need to do something to change behavior, relationships, psychology, and chemistry in order for people to get healthier and recover from mental illnesses and addictions. So there's no cure, no such thing. However, these things might be helpful. And I think the more we read and the more randomized controlled clinical trials for ketamine and LSD, microdosing, all these good things, the more we might be able to come up with a pharmacological choice that has fewer negative side effects than things like traditional antidepressants or benzodiazepine-based anti-anxiety drugs. And that's the hope. And that's the trend in the literature. And this is what you hear at scientific conferences. However, it's very, very difficult to do these things en masse because of all the social and scientific prohibitions against it and the government prohibitions against it. So we have a big social political dialogue that needs to happen. We need to talk more openly about their uses. We need to talk more openly about how they don't work. We need to talk more openly about the cost. And we also need to again, final point I'm going to make. No matter what the drug, no matter what the substance, whether it's a food or a drug or a drink or porn or clothing or whatever, you take your thing that can be paid for, some kind of societal economic cost. And so far, these things being on the black market and not a lower schedule is keeping the kind of drug world rich. Right? Because people are going to want to do these things. No different than any other drug of abuse like heroin or meth, or kids want to buy benzos or Adderall or whatever. There's a market for that. So we also need to be having a conversation about what do we do with the economic problem that is drug abuse and drug addiction. Because it's just as much an economic and societal problem as it is a neurological problem. Like it's a brain disease according to the, National Institute of Drug Abuse and the Surgeon General, And it's just as much as a social systemic problem, where there's family pathology that creates addiction too. So addiction, drug abuse is a very complex problem. Hallucinogens are not a solution to that. Hallucinogens might be a very, very, very small piece to helping people understand, learn, grow, manage feelings. But we don't have a lot of research. So acting as if they're a cure is ridiculous. Same thing with cannabis. It's ridiculous to think it's a cure. But to say it might play a small role, it could be useful in some ways, that's a fair statement. And that's what I'm all about, is intellectually honest discourse about these things. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I'll be back again next week with another talk, and I hope that you have a good week. I hope this was useful. I look forward to any and all comments, any and all debate, any and all thoughts, and I look forward to speaking with you again next week. Have a good Sunday.